Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey bestie, the world is a better place because you are in it. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button and join us as we change the world. I am here with the one and only Dr. Michelle Johnston, author of the best-selling book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership. And really excited to have you on. How's it going?
Oh, Nick, I'm so excited to be here. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you. So let's dive right in. Let's talk a little bit about your book. What drove you to write this bestseller?
Yeah, I gave a big 3-hour presentation yesterday and found myself, do you ever give presentations where you're listening to yourself talk out loud and you think, I can't believe I'm saying this?
Yeah, that's how I usually feel when I'm talking to my children.
And it was one of those moments where I realized that I've had so many seismic shifts. And once I started seeing the leaders that I coach have big seismic shifts, I just wanted to get the word out that old style command and control, authoritarian culture of fear, jerk bosses, that's just not cool anymore. And it's just not effective. And that is what drove me to write the book. I thought, okay, well, I'm only teaching about 30 undergraduates per class, about 30 MBA students. So I'm thinking 100 students a semester, that's not a big impact. I want to make a bigger impact. I want to save people. And that's kind of how I felt. Like if I didn't get the message out, more and more leaders would be getting pushed out of organizations because they were just doing what they thought was effective, and it's no longer effective.
Do you think it was ever effective?
No. That's a whole nother podcast. And yet we did it for years and years. I mean, what's crazy, I don't know about you, Nick, and I would love for you to share with the listeners, but in my book, I'm pretty revealing and do a lot of self-disclosure, which academics typically don't do at all. But I was like, you know what, if I'm going to make a difference, I got to put my stuff out there, my baggage, my stumbles, my falls. And I had just subscribed to that old style. As a matter of fact, you're going to love this. I was at a surprise birthday party at a fabulous venue Saturday night, and there were a bunch of my former students there. And they were teasing me for years ago, like 15 years ago. And they were teasing me saying, and they were like, Dr. Johnston. I was like, no, Michelle. And they said, oh my gosh, you were so hard on us. We would make a presentation and you would count how many uhs and likes and how many times we moved our hair. And I said, I am so sorry. I don't do that anymore. It was like this culture of shame. Like, yes, that was a good presentation, but you 500 times.
Right.
I mean, and although obviously it made an impact and we could laugh about it and they're better speakers, I believe there are different ways of teaching and educating than throwing people under the bus and shaming them in front of others.
So I'm glad to hear you're not going to be counting my ums. So that's good. That's like, it made me a little bit more relaxed. That's great. There's one. Okay. Where do you think this shift has happened? Because if it's never been effective, something went into everyone believing it was effective. I tend to think in my own schema that the greatest generation, as they're called, came back from the war. There was this, there was 2 world wars in the beginning of the 1900s, and a lot of those structures are what, like my grandfather, those few years that he was in the war, that colored his entire life. His whole room was all about, the ship he was on and, all of that stuff. And I think a lot of folks, and my cousin, he learned so much discipline from being in the Marine Corps. And that was such a defining thing. And I just tend to think that we had this huge portion of the population that had that sort of experience, that structured, regimented experience. They came back after the war, and there was this huge economic explosion. And all the factors of production in Europe were destroyed. So much production then shifted over to the United States. Like it was so much prosperity. And it seems only natural that, hey, I had this sort of, this worked in this military setting. Of course, I'm going to bring some of those things forward. And when you couple that with the old economy, as it were, which is all about manufacturing and, the hierarchies and so forth, it seems like that was just sort of a natural it seems like those structures that erected in our workplaces were just sort of the natural extension of those experiences. So how does that sound so far?
Oh my gosh, I think you're nailing it. Yes, yes, and yes.
So then what's causing
yes.
us to hit this tipping point where this seismic shift is happening? What are the catalysts for it?
Generational shift.
You think it's
I
that?
think it was
Okay.
the generational shift. And people like me, I'm a Gen Xer. I just followed, the orders. And I looked up to leaders like that. What was crazy, and the reason why I referred to my presentation yesterday, Nick, is because I was sharing, I was opening up my keynote with a story about my dad. And I said, I've got to be honest with you all. I said, I grew up with a dad who was all about being a servant leader. He was a great connector, a great communicator. He's he's still alive. He's 78, the most positive person I know. He inspired, he persuaded, and he was really good at his job. And so with General Motors, we moved around every 2 years. So every time they promoted him, we moved. And I said, and I don't blame him for having to go to all these different schools and high schools, because he was holding on to General Motors for dear life. He was like as loyal. I mean, he spent his whole career there. That's what they did back then, right? I said, but what was interesting to me is, even though I grew up with this incredible dad who truly led by connection, I ended up becoming a different type of leader, and I was influenced by the military drill sergeants, and I tried to pretend to be a military drill sergeant in my classroom. So it was odd to me that I didn't emulate him. But yet, if you think about what success looks like, success looks like whatever the leadership style is in your organization. So when I joined academia, they didn't have a me and they didn't have a dad like mine. And so I looked around, I said, well, this is what success looks like. And so I better tamper down my enthusiasm and my excitement every day for life, and walk into the classroom very serious and very demanding, because that's what success looked like, right? So it wasn't until, as I was sharing this with the audience yesterday, when I started doing research for my book, realizing, okay, that old command and control no longer works. It is all about connection. But what in the world is connection, and how can you connect? And I realized you had to first connect with yourself in order to truly connect with others. And at that time, I was not connected with myself. If you had said, Nick, tell me about yourself, Michelle, I would tell you about achievements. Well, my identity was, I'm a professor and I'm a tenured professor and I published this, but I didn't know who I was, because I just had been adapting. And honestly, Brene Brown's research and the book that she wrote, The Gifts of Imperfection, changed my life, because I was at that time a perfectionist, and I walked in every day with a mask of perfection. And I wouldn't let anybody into that. I was going to walk in and be this certain way. And once I really started studying her work on belonging, I realized, okay, I needed to work on myself. I needed to own my journey, own my story, figure out that there's no way you can ever belong if all you do is try to adapt and fit in. And that changed everything. And that is what started my research into true, meaningful connection. And I think, going back to the question you asked, what caused this, is there were kids sitting around the dinner table listening to their parents complain about what awful jerk bosses they had and what awful companies they had. And I think they woke up and said, I want something different. First of all, I'm not going to give my entire career to a company who doesn't care about me. Second of all, I'm not going to die of a heart attack. Third of all, I'm going to be healthy and happy and see my kids and not give all of my time to the office. I think they realized there's got to be a better way.
So much in what you just said. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, well, how did these data points that you saw as what success looks like, how were those able to persist? And it might come back to the false attribution that really stemmed from this shift in production to the United States, because like all this prosperity, the strong force wasn't necessarily those militant management styles. It was really driven by those factors of production shifting here. So that we had all this prosperity, and we as humans, I think, have a hard time separating correlation and causation. So we think, oh, well, that must have caused that. And it's interesting what you said, this other generation came and heard about all these jerk bosses. and there must be a better way. And I think when you couple those experiences with, the ebbs and flows of our, macro economy over the last like 3 to 4 decades, as as the nature of our economy has changed so much, I think it has caused people to reassess what actually works. When you came, I was also struck by this, you said, you had this great example of this sort of next gen leader in your father. And it's like you just kind of discounted all of that and you came, and you said, okay, I have to be like that. I had sort of a similar experience. I grew up in a small business that my parents had, and it was very familial. It was, kind of people over profits. It was like a family, they kind of went the extra mile for their people. My parents were very, performance driven for sure, but like very authentic. And, they had it was a really special thing. And I remember when I was coming out of undergrad, how excited I was to get into the real world and see how like real companies did it. And I was working in professional services, which was essentially consulting. And I was going into all these companies and I just had like the veil ripped from my eyes. And I was like, this is a freaking mess. And I was working in this like highly corporate structure where I felt the same way. Like I had to trim off these pieces of who I was and I had to be inauthentic and I had to put on this sort of carapace or this, this armor to emulate what clearly was, what success looked like, to your point. Then I started to think, I don't want to be like that person. I don't want to be like that person. And then I was kind of referencing back to my parents' business and I was like, well, that seems like the much better way to do it. A long-term focus, putting people over profits, trusting in the, universal law of reaping and sowing, and that I can't control the harvest, but I can control the seeds I plant and so forth. And it was a real kind of an eye-opener for me to kind of try to swing my own sort of personal pendulum back toward people aren't going to connect with this fake version of myself. People connect, the closest relationships you have are with the actual Michelle. It's not with this fake Michelle, Dr. Michelle, who's counting ums and ahs. Your closest relationships are those that are built on trust and understanding and like true human to human connection. And that can never happen through the barrier that is armor. You know what I mean?
I love the example you just shared with the audience, Nick, of you like, oh yeah, this small business. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Good job. Bravo, mom and dad. I want the real world. And then you get in there like, wait a second, I can't even be myself and
right.
Nobody's happy. And this is crazy. That is exactly right. So it's interesting. Yeah. So when I realized that it was all about connection, I didn't trust myself at that time
right.
to truly understand what that looked like. And so then I went and I interviewed 18 leaders all over the world to figure out connection and disconnection and consequences of disconnection. And then because most of the leaders, even the leaders who were really good at connection, they had stumbled, they had fallen, right? And then how do you figure it out? And I remember one of the best leaders, Pete November, he's the CEO of a hospital system. He was a lawyer, he was an accountant, he had worked all these different companies. And all of a sudden he was asked to come in and be in charge of mergers and acquisitions for this huge company. And he goes, Michelle, I've never been in a company that made presentations. I've never been in a company where I had to run these big executive meetings. Will you help me? And I became his coach. And yet, Nick, I never had to necessarily coach him, do this, do that. He said, Michelle, let's figure out a way to do it differently, because I'm seeing most executives they direct, talk, give orders, and I want to do it differently. So why don't you be a part of these executive meetings? And let's begin with a connection question. I want to get to know my people at a personal level. So let's go around like in November and ask them what their favorite Thanksgiving meal is. I'd love to know. Is it sweet potato casserole? Is it green bean casserole? Do you like the fried onions on top? Do you like the marshmallows? I said, seriously? He goes, seriously. And I'll never forget that meeting. It was one of our best meetings here at the time. He was, a huge executive of 40,000 employees. And yet we're on this Zoom hearing about sweet potato casserole for 15 or 20 minutes, getting to know each of his people so that then he could create this environment where he's like, okay, now I want to hear your updates. And I'm not going to sit here and talk to you the whole time. And so I started getting these real world examples of how leaders can almost flip that 80-20, where they think because they're in their position, they're supposed to be directing 80% of the time, when really the best leaders create this safe space. And connection it requires reciprocity and
Totally.
give and take. And so they open it up like, I care about you on a personal level, and I want to hear updates from everybody. How can we help each other? How can I remove the barriers so that you can be successful? And then at the very end of that 75-minute meeting, then Pete would come in and say, okay, here are the things that I've heard and that I think that you need to know. It was just a totally different way of doing things. And that to me is the new leadership style.
Yeah.
Is a style much more about give and take, much more about servant leadership, much more about the leader as the coach, the leader as the facilitator. I am here to help, but I'm not here to control.
You know, I think you could kind of get away with it when, you know, I keep going back to, you know, the sort of old economy versus the new economy. You could kind of get away with that command and control type of an approach when people were stamping machines and putting things in boxes. Whereas now the majority of our GDP is not generated from that type of work. It's generated from knowledge work. And knowledge work, we are our work. The human beings are the assets to get, you know, kind of really econ about it. And so how can someone give you their best work, and how can someone put their best effort toward pursuing or contributing to the mission of the organization just on a base physiological level, if there's cortisol running through their veins all the time, or if they're just wasting mental calories on keeping that facade up, or, you know, playing this sort of corporate game. I think it's a total headwind to the productivity of an organization. But it's interesting how, like, the light bulbs aren't on at the top across the world, across our economy. I mean, it's totally bizarre. And then people scratch their heads and wonder why the global employee engagement rate is at 68 or 69%. Well, it's because people, I mean, you could at least attribute some of that deadweight loss to people like wasting energy, you know, in, you know, maintaining a facade, or, you know, feeling like they can't actually commit to something because they don't have the belonging that you alluded to.
Yes, and we learned a lot, right, with the pandemic of what really mattered to people. And what we heard mattered is they did not want to be a part of a company that they didn't believe in. They didn't want to be led by a jerk boss. They wanted more. They wanted purpose. They wanted passion. They wanted meaning, but they also wanted to be seen, heard, valued, appreciated. And so that's when I realized that, to me, the definition of connection, and I came up with a quick little assessment for the leaders that I coach, and I sent it to their employees, their direct reports, and essentially is, does your leader see you, hear you, value your work, appreciate your work, respect you? And those 5 dimensions, that's what we want as humans.
Right.
And I'll never forget, I was working with Qualcomm during the pandemic. And so I'm in New Orleans, they're in San Diego. And anytime between the different variants, the chief marketing officer, Don McGuire, who was he's still there. He's one of the, I think, named by Forbes, one of the very best chief marketing officers. Great guy. He'd say, Michelle, fly out. Let's fly everybody in and let's work together on disruption. And I said, I appreciate that you're choosing me because you know I'm about connection. And so if you're going to get to the point of disruption, we got to first connect and really build cohesive teams and psychological safety and trust, because you hired so many people who have never even met all over the world. So let's bring them together, really spend some quality time. Give me a day of just working with them to build this safety net, and then we can disrupt. And I'll never forget, at the very end, and we did 3 different sessions, probably once a quarter. At the very end, my book had been just published and it was a bestseller, and he gave the book to everybody, and he and I did this fireside chat. And one of the leaders stood up and she said, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you. And he's like, you're welcome. For what? And she said, I left a company during the pandemic and joined you all because not once, I lived by myself as a single woman, couldn't leave the house in lockdown. And I had a leader who I would talk to every day. And not once did he ever ask me, how are you? And she said, hallelujah, I'm here and we're focusing on connection. So I think it just went back to the basics. We as humans need to be seen and heard and valued and respected and appreciated. So you also, so I need to figure out, and that's what I'm working on my next book, Nick. It's going to be Connection Drives Results. And I'm trying to figure out, how do you build a culture of connection? in order to drive results? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? What can leaders do? Because I think I made my case in my first book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership, that the old style is not working. We've got to focus on connection. And the second book has to give people a roadmap. Like, okay, here's what you do exactly. People need to know what to do.
Right. So it sounds like you're asking me for some ideas for the book. I'm just kidding.
Totally, because you're wicked smart, and I love hearing you talk. And please, we're recording this. Give me some ideas. What does a culture of connection look like? What would that look like to you? It sounds like your parents figured it out in their small business.
Well, I think so. When me and my brother took over this company 7 years ago, we always, we moved around a lot growing up as well. And our family, I'm a first generation American, so I always felt very different. But so we're moving around, and our family was like this, I don't know, we were like this galvanized unit. Like our family culture was very unique. It was one that was all about performance for sure, but there was a lot of love, and we all felt accepted, and we felt a deep belonging. And from generation to generation, like me, my brother, my two sisters, our house was like a magnet, like all of our friends would want to come over and be there because it just felt so different. And when I got into private equity, I saw that the companies in our portfolio would kind of fall into two buckets. There were companies with good cultures and companies with like not so good cultures. The good cultures, the CEO could walk through the shop room floor and he knew everyone's name, and not because he could quickly glance at their name tag, but because he knew these people. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, I talk about, this is just the best example. This guy would make everyone call him Mr. So-and-so, a 9-foot freaking mural. I mean, I just didn't know a guy could sit for so many murals. Murals in the plant of him, very old school. In that company, there was just no belonging. And for that company, as a matter of fact, private equity, you're buying companies and you're putting them together. And we bought this one company to combine it, and it was an ESOP. So it was an employee-owned company. And you walked through that company, and it was like, I was like, I don't have to even look at anything here. Everyone here is so engaged. Everyone would stop and pick up some trash in the hallway. And, we were kind of scratching our heads when we got the book because their margins were so much higher. And we got there and it was like, okay, this is why, because everyone's like working hard. Everyone feels like a part of it. And it was so bizarre. It wasn't surprising, but it was bizarre how fast it happened. Like as soon as it was folded into this larger organization, which I'll just call it, as a shorthand, call like a heartless organization, you just saw those margins, drop down to like the industry average. And it was because that engagement wasn't there. And so, my brother saw a similar thing because he was in private equity too. And we always wanted to run a business together since we were young guys. And we wanted to kind of take what we learned in our parents' business and what we saw, both what worked and what didn't work, and just kind of do this experiment for, the company if, Lord willing, we had the chance to do it. And we always said, we wanted to make a company that was culture over everything, because I just think culture is the only sustainable competitive advantage. Like our strong culture is the only sustainable competitive advantage, because like our heartless competitor can't walk around with a riding crop or a bullhorn and scream, care about each other, love each other. Like that can't happen. That has to come up organically. And so we spend a lot of time and continue to, we don't get it right all the time. A culture is kind of like a weather pattern. It seems to like move all the time. But we knew that if we could get a culture right and be a place that felt different, from someone coming in for an interview to somebody working here to somebody leaving and looking back with, in the rearview mirror of their life, with fondness at their time that they spent here, or even someone delivering a sandwich being like, what do you guys do here? This place feels a little bit weird. That's what we were kind of trying to go for, because that's the only thing that can sustain. Because to your point, how can you disrupt if you're not connected, right? Like if everyone feels connected and unified, then you can be disruptive, or you can move as a team. And a team is just a sum total of a bunch of individuals, just like a culture is just the sum total of everyone's beliefs and experiences and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing we did is we just flipped our org chart upside down, and we made kind of a big deal about it. But, we shouldn't be the pharaoh at the top of the pyramid. We need to be the roots of the tree that are pulling those nutrients. And that's just the philosophy and the mentality. And I think when we can put ourselves, explicitly as the chief servants of our organization, it reframes what our job is. I think our job, to your point, is not to just scream at people and say, go get my money. It's to empower them. And, obviously we need to be able to balance both, just like we were in my family, of belonging and performance, because we're a for-profit organization and we want to do a good job, and success is measured by expansion and growth and all those kinds of things. But I can't control or compel someone to give me discretionary effort. You just can't. They have to want to do that. And, I'm rambling a little bit, but no.
Gosh, I love it. I love it. Yes, yes, and yes. I love how heartless. I love how you describe the organizations that didn't have good cultures as heartless. And then I love how you described a positive culture as your true differentiator. And then I love how you turn the organizational chart upside down and say we're the chief servant leaders, right? And we're at the bottom.
Yeah, and I mean, what else am I supposed to do, right? Like, I'm not the king of the company. Like, I don't pay the checks. Our clients pay the checks. So if anyone's at the top of that org chart, that should be the people that we should all be serving. But I also can't force them. Like, how can we force our employees, our people on our team to be servants to their teams, to our clients, if we ourselves aren't modeling servanthood? You know what I'm saying? So, and I think when you flip that, and so I think flipping that is one thing, but then also kind of trusting, having like a longer term focus is, I think, the absolute key. Because we live in this sort of short termism right now where it's like, the stereotype is the CEO who's like doing whatever they can to hit their quarterly numbers so that the Wall Street analysts don't downgrade the stock and everyone's stock options go down. And what I've found is that the best companies, the best CEOs are ones that prioritize this kind of stuff that you and I are talking about. And, some of them are even willing to go as far as saying, I'm not giving you any guidance. I'm not giving Wall Street any kind of a guidance. And I'm not going to tell you what our numbers are going to be because I don't even know how my afternoon is going to go. You want me to tell you how the quarter is going to go across, hundreds and hundreds of people and stuff like that? So I think being able to let go a little bit of, white knuckling the steering wheel and again, trusting that sort of universal law of reaping and sowing and knowing, okay, if I can put good people in place here and give them the tools to succeed, the harvest will come. It might not come when you think. It's not going to come on a straight line, like nothing grows on a straight line, But letting go a little bit of that short-termism, trusting sort of the process, trusting sort of how the world works a little bit, and being willing to become more of a servant, it just opens up so much more time for that connection, right?
I couldn't agree with you more, Nick. And what's frustrating to me as an author and a coach and a professor who's a little obsessed with this is how many leaders I hear from. They're like, oh, I said, well, how's your culture? Oh, I've got a culture committee. They're in charge of that. They do a couple happy hours.
Great.
Like, okay, that's the shift that we need.
Right.
That's the shift, that it can't be just a committee doing a happy hour. Culture has to come from the top. It's got to be everybody connected and doing it together because it matters. As humans, we matter. Culture is everything. So what I'm trying to do is help people, like I said, create cultures of connection at every level. And again, it goes back to spending a lot of time with yourself and reflecting on your childhood and your leadership and what you want and your purpose and your passion so that you can show up authentically. You can show up really connected to yourself so that other people trust you and they know that you're real. And then and only then can you connect with your team and build that psychological safety. And then you can connect everybody towards that vision and towards that mission. So I believe it is at that 3 levels. And then my guess what I need to do in my next book, which I didn't do in my first book, is talk about connection with community. Mm-hmm. I mean, it goes so much beyond just the individual, the team, and the company you work for. Let's connect. Like, again, another lesson from the pandemic. We need each other. Mm-hmm. And the people who are still at home saying, I don't ever want to go to an office again, that they're struggling too, because then they're like, but I miss people. We miss each other, right? This is hard. And so we've got to figure out how communities can create cultures of connection as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. I think it starts, though, on the individual level. Like, we have to be connectable pieces in the puzzle. And if we're guarded, I mean, I've worked in places where it's like you walk in the room and you better find a wall because you're going to get knifed in the back if you don't. You know what I'm saying?
Isn't that horrible?
Well, it's brutal, but it's also not that uncommon, And a friend of mine, Ellen, talks about this concept of ethical refugees because, such a huge proportion of people during the Great Resignation changed jobs because of exactly what you said, because they didn't believe in the values of the organization, right? Every company has this values page or whatever, and they have a beautiful code of conduct with all the diversity pictures, and it's all shiny. And it's like, well, that's at best aspirational, because we all know that like that perfection is not lived out every single day. And I think people have a lot of grace for an organization that's like authentically trying to close that gap, but they have like no grace at all and no patience, to your point, because we're not staying in an organization for our whole lives anymore. Labor mobility is so high. They have no patience for someone that's kind of inauthentically touting this thing. And so they're like, screw it, I'm going to leave. And that jadedness, I think all of us have experienced it at some level, or at least seen somebody close to us get chewed up and spit out by a company. And I just don't think people they don't have any patience for it. So I'm just saying that there's a huge opportunity, I think, for leaders to, like after like I don't know, like a fire or something, or like a natural disaster, people are like wrapped in those they look like foil blankets.
Yeah.
Like we can wrap those ethical refugees in a foil blanket and turn them, kind of shave away some of that jadedness that they might be carrying with them, some of that baggage, and turn them into real, culture champions. If with I think a little intentionality, and B, a willingness to, as you said, be a little bit more authentic and not come in with the furrowed brow and the tally sheet for ums and ahs or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like we're all human beings. We're all like going through our own journey. None of us are perfect. And none of us can kind of do it alone, right? Unless you're like a one person business. So yeah, but like I just see so many leaders struggle with like dropping that like facade. Like how do you help how do you help your folks, that you coach?
We just did that. Yeah. Yesterday in that 3-hour presentation, I was working with 100 principals of schools in our region.
Oh, wow.
And their homework was to demonstrate authenticity. We wanted them to really share their stories. And so many of them had shared the examples of, well, people expect us as principals to be perfect just by the title. And they said that based on they were going to read, their homework was to read my book over the summer. And then I'm working with them each quarter. And so their homework was to go in with their people and share their story. And they said it was life-changing because so many of them were divorced and dealing with, sick parents and big challenges. And by just them sharing their story, it made them real. They were humans. And all of a sudden their team's like, oh my gosh, you mean I can make mistakes too? I can stumble too. And once you have that permission to stumble, then that's what drives innovation.
100%.
Connection drives innovation because then it makes it safe to take risks, ask stupid questions, stumble, but then get to that real innovative space. And so I was just moved yesterday, Nick, by the stories by men and women who said, I felt for years I had to be perfect. People had to see me as perfect. And I didn't realize then I was placing that pressure on my people to be perfect. And I had inadvertently created a culture of fear.
Right.
And that is not, and what's interesting too, what they said, which has to do with our conversation is so many parents in the old days wanted those tough, strict schools. And now the kids have much more power saying, I want to go to a place where I belong and it's fun and the principals put on costumes and learning is fun and we're part of a team and a tribe. And it's totally different in schools now.
Totally.
And now the principals are having to change. Like, okay, I need to be a real person and I need to be able to laugh and I need to be able to create an environment that is fun and challenging. This is all, again, there are so many seismic shifts happening in so many different industries at so many different levels. I just find it an exciting time. Hallelujah.
Yeah, hallelujah is right. It's not only like a more fun way to like work, it's also, it's such a hack as well. Like it's such a powerful hack. So you get kind of the best of both worlds. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this principal who's maybe had a divorce or these other struggles, who has to kind of keep this facade up, and how powerful it is to drop it. And this happens for me. It's happened dozens of times at this point where like there's some public figure that I'm like, I hate that person's music, or I hate that actor. And then I like watch a documentary about him. Yeah. And then I just love him. So I'm like, oh, it's just like a person, it's like, oh, I see that. And then I've had this like weird connection with them because I've seen past this like public persona or this facade. So like, how can we do that documentary type of like hack as leaders to have people see us as humans? Because I mean, it just takes so much effort to put that facade up all the time, and it's absolutely insane. And it's, I mean, at some level, you could argue it's like not even ethical because in order for that facade to be real, it implies that like there's sort of a flawlessness that none of us have. You know what I'm saying? Like we're all fallible people. And
I thought about that today when I was kind of thinking about being on your podcast and having the ethical theme. I thought that same exact kind of the if you show up as fake every day, then that is not really ethical.
it isn't.
It's not. So I never thought of it until I was on your podcast, that to be an authentic leader is to be an ethical leader.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's something so profound in what you just said, and it's totally overlooked. But again, it comes back to like, are you going to be others focused or are you going to be self focused? And if you I learned about this interesting like trust equation, and the trust equation is a fraction, and in the numerator is, you know, things like credibility, reliability, and like intimacy or authenticity, right? So you want those to go higher if you're going to build trust. But there's one thing in the denominator, and that is a self-focus. So obviously, if the number in the denominator in any, you know, fraction, if the number in the denominator increases, the output drops a lot, right? So like if you're focused on yourself all the time, that is the biggest trust killer, even if you're credible, even if you're reliable, even if you have this, you know, whatever you want to call authenticity. And so literally the most ethical thing you can do is to create a culture of, you know, this is kind of my thing. Like the most ethical thing that we as leaders can do is to build a culture of, you know, an ethical culture of like authentic integrity, which is only possible, you know, because the foundation of that must be trust, by focusing outward on other people. And when you're focusing on other people, it's like you have less time to think about yourself, that you have less time to like protect yourself, to keep those guards up and so forth. And then you're more prone to, you know, inadvertently increase that authenticity to share what you fear and what you struggle with and all those other things, which allows us to connect a lot more. We do this thing that I think you might like. I'll just tell you really quickly. When anyone comes into the company, we do what's called day zero. So instead of day one, you know, sometimes we miss it by a day or two, but the idea is your first day in the company, we all get into a room, you know, me and my brother and whoever is joining that class. And before you're filling out forms and doing your compliance training and stuff like that, we talk about our culture, we talk about our organization, and we spend time like telling our personal stories. And like, it is like one of my favorite things. I get chills just thinking about it because sometimes people are sharing things. The whole room is, you know, we had one where the whole room is crying, you know, everyone's sharing these things that they have never shared at work before. And it really like humanizes us all. And again, it forces us to like incorporate corporately some kind of a connection, like ritual before people start doing what their actual job is. And if we can help make that connection and then show how each of our roles fit into this broader story and our vision and so forth. Like we've had a lot of success with it. It takes a lot of time for sure, but it's something that's so powerful that I don't know. I love it. I would just like recommend that to anybody, you know.
Bravo, Nick. That is absolutely one of the elements of how you create a culture of connection. You sit down in a team and you share your story. You own it and you have to actually think about it. And what is a significant life event that impacted how you lead? That's what I do. That's what I have them think about. And then share it. And that is how you build a cohesive team. And all of a sudden you trust it. Once you know somebody's story, there's very little room for judgment. But if you don't know somebody's story, then you're a human and you're going to assume, unfortunately, negatively, if given the chance. So if you show up and you never share anything about your personal life and you just make it all business, but then you mess up and nobody knows anything about you and where you came and your story, then they're going to assume the worst, right? So don't give them that opportunity. Don't give anybody the opportunity to make up your own story. You've got to own your story and share it. However, I also tell people you need to do it like in an environment that you create. This is day zero. Welcome to the company. And I want you to know who we are and I want to know who you are. You need to do it in a safe space. It's not something like when I do this exercise with every single class that I teach. The first week of class, I don't even give them an opportunity like you to get to know each other. I'm like, no, we're going to share each other's stories. We're going to create a cohesive team immediately because then that ends up making better conversations and discussions, and the learning is more powerful. Let's create that environment in the classroom where we can trust one another. And so many people are like, wait, is this an elevator speech? No, 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 no.
Yeah.
No, this is not something you go and share at all. This is how to build a team. It's very
Totally.
different than how to sell yourself, right?
Yeah, and then when you see that, it forces everyone to we talk about diversity and inclusion and all these different concepts, but it forces everyone to see, to your point, the three dimensionality of us. Like it's so easy to just, especially in like a remote environment, like it's easy to just be like, oh, that's just like a two-dimensional thing. This person I'm speaking to, but people have a life, they have their own struggles, they have family issues, they have all these things that, they have baggage that they've that they're carrying around. And what I found is like when people get really like authentic and raw in those conversations, you definitely see them. You definitely see what what they've overcome, and it ends up turning into this like super inspirational thing because like anyone who's alive is still standing, right? And like life isn't easy for anybody. You've overcome so many things, and it's it just like forces us to like connect on the base level thing, which I think is our humanity.
Totally. And as individuals, we tend to think that we're the ones who, oh my gosh, my childhood was so hard. Or, I've had such a difficult life. And then all of a sudden, when you do an exercise, you realize everybody's had it. Life is hard.
Totally.
We've all had big time struggles. And the more you hear about it, right? That's why social media is really having, it's a tough thing for our kids because they only see the best. They only see the best, and then they assume that their life isn't as great as everybody else's, and that social comparison is horrible.
Isn't that interesting though? It's like we have on the one hand this desire for more authenticity and like not doing it the old way, but then there's like this counterbalance on social of us constantly being bombarded. You can't control what's in your feed, constantly bombarded by these pictures and these, of like perfection that are clearly not attainable and they're clearly not sustainable. I was talking to my friend and he was like, anytime you see somebody on Instagram that's like they got a good pump, they're in good lighting, I'm saying like they don't typically actually look like that, but you can't process that in the instant that you see it. So it's an interesting kind of like it's like this countervailing force that's in our world that's maybe preventing the seismic shift from happening like faster than it could or something. I don't know.
Well said. Well said. I love listening to your brain.
Wow, that's so sweet.
I love it. It's really awesome. It sounds like you've created an excellent environment, and it sounds like you know how to create a culture of connection. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. I don't know if we know how to do it. I think we try to do it, but that's all I think you can do. You can just keep trying to whittle it down and push it forward. Let me ask you, what your path was to writing the book. I'd love to just hear kind of, your story and how did the coaching fit into it? And when did you have the idea to say, okay, I have to write this book? What was that process like? And I'd love to hear, what a win to get that bestseller status. I mean, that's phenomenal. What a great confirmation of this dream you had. At some point, this just existed in your mind and now it's out and it's on people's bookshelves and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's super cool. So I think I started getting tired of seeing leaders get pushed out of organizations who might be perceived as jerk bosses, but they were just doing what they thought was effective and what their boss did. And I had great empathy for that. And oftentimes I was trying to coach them, and yet I couldn't save them. It was almost too late, right? The trust had been broken. They were perfectionists and they were demanding perfection from their people, and they were shaming them on Zoom calls if they had an Excel cell that was incorrect.
Yeah.
And people were coming to me saying this is affecting my physical health. And I mean, I was just seeing it all transpire and wanting to help. So that's what drove me to write the book, that's not working anymore. We have to figure out a new way to lead in order to motivate and inspire people. And then I was so inspired once I started really interviewing all these phenomenal leaders and learning about connection and disconnection. And what's interesting about me as an author is I had a graduate assistant, Christina Jackson, who ended up writing the afterword of the book. And it's some of the best writing in the book. She's brilliant. And she was an MBA student at the time of mine. And I would meet with her once a week. So you asked the process. I'd meet with her once a week and I would just talk and she'd type. And I'd say, here's what I'm seeing. Bop, 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 bop. Here's what I'm seeing. This is working. This isn't working. And then this, and she would just type it out. And then I would look at it and I'd say, okay, And then
Cool.
we'd look at all the interviews and we'd come out with the themes. I mean, it was a really interesting. So it was not me alone
Totally.
typing on my computer at all. It was a real interactive process and a more of an oral process and her transcribe. It was super cool. It took years. So the book was about to go off to the publisher in March of 2020. So here I had written a book on connection, and all of a sudden the government told all of us to stay at home. And so we had a worldwide order to be disconnected. And I
Yeah.
called my publisher and I said, I cannot publish a book on connection when none of us can connect right now. Let's figure out how to connect in disconnected time. So the publisher gave me, I didn't know it would be 2 years. I said, give me time to go back. And it took 2 years to go back and interview all of those leaders again and say, okay, now the world has changed. How do we connect in a disconnected world? So the reason why I think it was a bestseller is two reasons. I held on to that and I didn't publish it until we were coming out of the pandemic. Number one, timing.
Yeah. Smart.
And number two, a book on connection when we're all coming out thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how important connection was. I can't go back to just focusing on widgets and results every day of my life. We have to show up as full humans, and we have to see each other as full humans, and we have to appreciate each other as full humans. So I think the message of connection and the timing were pretty cool.
Yeah, that process sounds really cool. It sounds really organic, and how lucky to have that sort of longitudinal experience with these leaders. Tell us a little, like, what did you find, right? You talked to them before the pandemic, and they had all these ideas on connection, and then you talked to them kind of in the midst of it or right as you were kind of ending it. What through line did you see with those folks? What was surprising and what was, I don't know, in retrospect, maybe like obvious?
Yeah, you had mentioned a crisis earlier in that jacket, that blanket that people wear. One of the things I found from the leaders is they kept saying this crisis is actually bringing out the best in our people because we have one priority, we have one purpose, and we belong together. And we're thinking creatively, we're thinking outside of the box. We trust one another because we know we're all moving in the same direction, trying to figure out how to make money during a pandemic, right?
Interesting.
And so
There's a lot in what you just said. That's really
yes,
interesting. Yeah.
yes,
Sorry,
yes,
go ahead.
and yes, yes. And so what a lot of these leaders said is we've got to, when we return to work and to the office, we have to do things differently. We've got to create what we just saw that was so successful in creating a tribe with a unified purpose where they've got each other's back, they assume positive intent, and they're passionate about it. And so Juan Martin, who's the global president of Kind Bars,
Oh,
KIND, the
yeah.
Kind Bars, I spent a lot of time with him on interviews when he got stuck in Madrid. His house was in New York City, two small children and a wife, and yet during the lockdown, he's from Spain, so he got stuck in his apartment in Madrid. And I remember just interviewing him again and again, and he had this tiny little office that didn't even have a door and two toddlers running around and a wife, and he's trying to run this global company.
Wow.
And it was just fascinating. He said, so the two things I learned from Juan, he said, first of all, I'm trying to, not just through Kind Bars and how we treat ourselves, I want us to inhale and ingest healthy food. That's why we make Kind Bars, but I want us to be kind to each other. So I'm actually evaluated by the president of Mars on how many acts of kindness each year. I said, how many acts of kindness, Juan? He goes, 250 million. He said, because of the multiplier effect. That was my goal. I didn't quite meet it, but I'm going to meet it next year because we need kinder relationships. We need kinder food, and we need to be kind to our planet. I loved that holistic philosophy. And to me, connection and kindness are very related. The second thing that I learned from Juan is I interviewed him after he got back to New York and they reopened the office, and his employees were still telling him, I want to work at home on Mondays and Fridays, but I'll come in Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So they redid the entire office to make it collaborative. So now he's like, so on Mondays and Fridays, work in front of your computer without any human contact. But when you come to our headquarters at Mars in New York, he goes, I don't even have, goes back to the days when I was stuck in my apartment in Madrid without an office door. He goes, I don't even have an office door in the corporate office because it's all about community and belonging and communication and connection and collaboration. So just the way that they work now is different.
It's so interesting. Like, it sounds like your dad was one of these kinds of people.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Isn't that wild? Yeah.
It is crazy. And it's...
And your parents too.
Yeah, totally. But it sounds like it's like a heart thing, and it's a view of the world thing, and it's easier to assume positive intent when you think people are doing their best. I know we're over. I just have one more quick thing to say. I don't know if you hear about this Frontier Airlines CEO who came out today or yesterday? You got to look this up. It's just interesting how on the back end of this whole pandemic, it seems like people are grouped into two different sort of categories. Leaders are grouped into these two different categories. One is, the kind bar guy who, was able to kind of maintain the energy through it. There seems like there's a camaraderie or, a tribalism with that organization, a people first approach. And then folks on this other side that are just like, well, we got real lazy during the pandemic. And there's almost like this warring between, the employees and the leaders. And it's just, it's an interesting dichotomy that I think we're seeing and so forth. I could talk to you all day.
I could talk to you all day. I love your brain, and you obviously are using it and creating a positive culture, and you're interviewing cool people. I'm so honored to be a guest on your podcast. Thank you, Nick.
Well, thanks for joining us. We can find you on LinkedIn. You have a great LinkedIn presence and a LinkedIn page. Check out the book, The Seismic Shift of Leadership. Is it in leadership or of leadership?
The Seismic Shift in Leadership.
The Seismic Shift in Leadership. It's phenomenal. Thank you so much, Michelle. We'll see you soon.
Oh, Nick, thank you so much. Thank you. Have a beautiful rest of your Friday. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.